Good evening and welcome back to 13 Horror Nights. It's episode 9 and tonight's movie is It. Now, I have actually read the book It, or at least like 95% of it, and I did not think it was very good. It was too long, the plot was kind of standard, all the characters were so stereotypical that they weren't really relatable. So if I was just going on that, I wouldn't pick this as something to watch. But I cannot think of a single horror movie in recent years that has had this much of an impact on the public consciousness. It made an insane amount of money at the box office. There were memes about it. People were talking about it. It was everywhere. And I referenced the fact that I'm going to be watching this movie twice so far. One of them saying that one of these movies is very fresh in the public consciousness, and this one is, considering that It Chapter 2 is out in theaters right now. And the other one saying that it wasn't the longest movie I was watching. This one is. So yeah, this movie was everywhere, it was well received, it blew out the box office, and it's a horror remake. That is so rare. There are essentially zero well-received horror remakes. There already was an It movie, or like an It miniseries that came out in 1990, and that was received well enough. This one was actually received better. When it comes to horror movies, this movie is basically a mythological creature. It shouldn't exist. At this point, there's no reason to not watch it for a series like this. And the trailer looks decent, and also, this movie does seem to have at least a little bit of a sense of humor about itself, which I do believe is very necessary for a movie like It, because, again, especially in the book, sometimes it can get a little bit silly. So, if this movie can balance the fear and the fun of this, I think it's going to do very well. I will say right off the bat that this Pennywise looks a lot scarier than the Tim Curry Pennywise, and they definitely seem to try to go for more subtlety than what was in the book. But for me, the biggest problem with It as a book wasn't the premise at all, it was the characters. They were not written well, they were stereotypes, they were predictable. And I hope that they update that in this film. But the only way to answer these questions is to just watch the film, so I'll see you guys once I'm done watching all 2 hours and 15 minutes of It. Alright, now that I've watched it, I think it was pretty good. I'm giving it an 8 out of 10. It's not perfect, it definitely has problems, and I do think a lot of the problems just come from the fact that the source material is so flawed. Like, I downplayed that in, like, the first part of this. There are so many things wrong with It, the book, but It, the movie, was a lot better than the book, and it was actually good. It was really good. One big difference between the book and the first miniseries of It and this one is that in the book, the child parts of the movie, of the story, were taking place in the 50s, and this one is taking place in the late 80s, and I do think that helped to, like, modernize it, because there's a lot of things that just are too outlandish for happening probably even in the 50s, but especially not in, like, the 80s, and also considering the fact that these are kids, and the way they talk, and the way they act, that needs to be updated a little bit for it to at all be relatable for someone in the modern day. And there's one thing I want to give major props to It for. It actually had kids playing kids who are their age. A lot of times in the movies, they think they can get away with people in, like, their 20s playing kids in high school. And a lot of times, it just does not vibe up. That's one of the problems I had with Hereditary. It did not match up with Peter's character. With the actors in It, all of them were, like, 14, 15 at the time of the movie's release. So they were even younger when it was being filmed. And they're good actors, too. And yes, I was in early high school not long ago. The way that they talk is a lot like the way that kids those age talk. And then we also have to talk about Bill Skarsgård as It, or Pennywise the Dancing Clown. Now, I've only seen clips of it, but Tim Curry's performance as Pennywise in the 1990 miniseries was unbelievably campy, not scary in the slightest. And in this one, there is still elements of camp to it. He's like this Pennywise is like really wall-eyed, his eyes stare off in opposite directions, and like his mouth is like this really weird placement, and his head, I don't know if that's a prosthetic or something, but there are some really silly aspects to this one. There's one thing that I don't understand if they wanted to make this creepy. It was like he was dancing, but the camera was like fixed on his head and was tracking his head and everything else moved. It wasn't scary, it was just weird. And also just the voice and the performance, a lot of times it reads more as clown than demonic killer. I also feel like a lot of my feelings towards Pennywise as a villain stems from the fact that I'm not afraid of clowns. For me, clowns can be creepy, they can never really be scary, at least not on their own. All things considered, this is probably the scariest they could have gotten, just like a normal clown to look. And when you compare Bill Skarsgård's performance to Tim Curry's performance, in this one, as silly as it can be sometime with the 2017 movie, at the very least, he is putting his all into this performance, and he wants to be scary, and he's taking this seriously. An impression I did not get from the Tim Curry Pennywise. But, ironically enough, the best part of It, the movie, is nothing to do with It, the monster. It's the relationship that these kids have with each other, and the scenes that they have. They really do just come off as normal kids. These aren't these, like, little angels or, like, the only nice people in this entire town. In the book, every single character, except for the 7 main characters, was completely reprehensible. And they meant it to be that way. But in this one, they really are just, like, normal kids living in a town. I think out of all of them, my favorite one was Bill, the one who stuttered. Because, well, he was just really relatable with, like, his struggles. Because the first scene of the movie is his little brother Georgie going out with a paper boat that Bill helped make, and then he gets dragged into the sewers and killed. And he feels so guilty about that he wasn't there to help. All the kids have story arcs in this movie, but out of all of them, I think that Bill's was done the best. As a coming-of-age story, it's pretty good, but as a horror movie, that's where I find it wanting. As horrifying as the monster is as a concept, that doesn't detract from the fact that its default form is still very much a clown. Even when it's trying to be scary, it's still really goofy. It has this goofy face and a kind of goofy voice. It really just makes me wonder why Stephen King decided to give this monster a standard form at all. Because they established that it can turn into whatever the person is fearing the most. Why not just have the monster always look like what the person looking at it fears the most? For lack of any other reference points, why not just make it like a boggart from Harry Potter? I don't see the reason why it needed to be a clown. The effects in this movie are pretty good. It's this nice mix of practical effects and decent CGI. Actually, I came to the realization that the aliens from A Quiet Place, the way that their heads split open is a lot like the way that Pennywise's head splits open a few times in this movie. Like a few of the other movies that I've watched this 13 Horror Nights, I think that it comes out a lot better if you come into it looking for more like a drama than a scary movie, because in my opinion it wasn't really that scary. But if you look at it as like a coming of age movie about these 7 kids like learning about friendship and growing up together, then it's really good. Like, there were a lot of really touching scenes in this movie. There were a lot of very charming scenes in this movie. I feel like the more it got away from, to be honest, the source material, the better it fared. I can understand why it became the phenomenon that it did, because it took this idea and did everything it could to make it work. And I think that's very admirable. I thought that it was a very good movie. It's not my favorite, but I can understand why a lot of people like it so much. And this is where the spoilers start. The reason why they're so interested in whatever phenomenon is making all these kids disappear is because they notice that it seems to run on a cycle. Every single 27 years, a bunch of people in the town die or disappear, and figure out that it all links to something underground in the sewer system. And eventually they realize that this is that horrifying clown that they keep seeing. And after the kids almost die a few times, most of them are just done with it and they want to forget about it, despite what the, probably the 2 most, like, take charge characters, Bill and Beverly, what they believe. But Bevy actually gets captured by the monster, so the other 6 go into the sewers to try to rescue her. And there's a lot of scenes of the characters, like, coming to realize that all it wants to do is divide them and make them scared. And as long as they stay together and not be afraid, they can win. The problem is that I think at some points it was a little too on the nose. Like, it felt like they were kind of just defeating it with the power of friendship. And while that is kind of charming in its own way, it's not exactly something you're going to take that seriously. Probably my favorite scene in the movie is what happened when Bill sees Pennywise masquerading as Georgie. And there's this really sad moment where he says, "I'm so sorry, I wish you could be back in my home." But then he holds up I actually don't even know what it was. I think it's a crossbow that Mike's family's farm uses to kill sheep or whatever. And he like raises it up and says, "You're not Georgie," and then he shoots him in the head, and then he falls over, and then after that really good dramatic moment, there's this really silly moment where he like spazzes out and convulses on the ground, and then Pennywise the clown pops out. But for that moment, it was really good and really heavy. And then compounding on the silliness is the way that they kill the monster, because they're all just like beating it with whatever they can get their hands on, stabbing it. There's a lot of scenes where they're like spinning around, like the clown is like whipping them around, and it's not that scary at all to me. It was kind of silly. But they do eventually defeat it by saying, "We're no longer afraid of you." And then it just kind of like disappears. And then they all make a promise that if it comes back in the 27 years later, they will return to Derry and finish it once for all. And then there's this really touching moment where they all like cut their hands and join hands to create like this pact. As I've already said, it is the best when it's not being a horror movie, when it's being like a coming of age story. And for that, it works very well. As a horror movie, I do find it wanting, but when you see like it go back and forth between the two of them, overall, I thought it was a pretty good experience. It has a few decent scares, but most of its best moments aren't horror. It had good acting and good directing, but I think overall, the biggest problem is also just the fact that it wasn't really my thing, personally. I can understand why somebody else would like it a lot. Alright, I'll see you guys on Friday.